Just because your lot in this fantasy world is that of a miserable peasant doesn't mean that your house has to be vile too. Oh, maybe it does. Hi folks, welcome to Glitter Void Gamecraft. My name is Eric, and this week we're continuing our fantasy village terrain building series with this, a farmhouse. Now this started out as one video, and then expanded into 2, and then expanded into 3. I'm trying to keep these to a reasonable length, but there's just so many elements of that kind of classic farm that I wanted to capture with at least one piece of terrain. After all, other than hunting bandits in the forest or rats in a cellar, what is a more iconic first level quest than helping farmer what's-his-name with an infestation of fill in the blank of first level monsters? More ideas on ways to use this and some of the other pieces of terrain in the farm mini-series, I guess, at a later video. For now, let's get crafting. The floor plan for this was going to be pretty simple. One main room and one smaller room off to the side. A few minutes of Google research says that that's not the most historically accurate, but I always default to the rule of cool. History is great, but it's not always the most fantastical. On a separate base, I would put a small animal pen, and on a third separate base, I was originally going to do a field segment, but I quickly realized I was biting off a bit more than I could chew and needed to stick to one piece per video. The walls would be made out of dollar store foam core board. In the last video, I encountered a problem where too much texture was causing the boards to weaken, so for this I was going to make the walls double thick. This would require some tricky measurements, as I wanted to make sure that the inside of the building maintained the same size of the rooms and didn't get eaten up and make it too hard to play miniatures in there. There would have to be an interior wall that was slightly larger than the base that I wanted the inside to be, and then a wall on the outside of that that was then as much bigger as the total thickness of the walls that I was already adding. Now the easiest way to do this would be to have some sort of jig and be able to cut the end pieces at 45-degree angles so they join together in concentric boxes. What I ended up going with was making the short walls 2 identical sized pieces and then making the interior of the long walls shorter than the exterior, creating a little wedge for the 2 small end pieces to fit into. I ended up taping the pieces together temporarily just so I could make sure what was happening in my mind was going to work at all in the real world. The base for the building was just a solid piece of the dollar store foam core that I added the wood grain and planking to. When doing wood planking on pieces this large, you can sometimes get a bit of a wandering pencil where your boards are too thick. With such a large area to cover, you can try to take shortcuts by making the boards extra wide, or you're just not focused and you put too much wave and then you have a huge deviation. I often use the grid of my cutting mat to check in and make sure that the lines aren't deviating too much from each other. I attached the wall pieces together using hot glue since I found that white glue won't dry in areas this large. I left the papers on the outside to make sure I could keep track of which side was which. At least that was my plan when I immediately glued the wrong sides together. Fortunately, it was hot glue, which was still easy enough to pull apart, but in the process I created this neat spiderwebby texture that I kind of wanted to keep. I'd have to remember this for future projects, but in the meantime I just removed the dried glue from the insides and reattached them. To create the wattle and daub muddy texture, I just rolled a piece of tin foil over the exterior and interior walls. In a lot of the pictures I saw of this kind of wall, there would be places where the mud would be cracked and you would see the woven texture underneath. So I created this small piece out of chipboard and just pressed it really hard into the side, right up next to where the ceiling would be. This created a small indentation where I could then carve in the woven branch texture of the underlying material. I then carved in some cracks here and there all over just to make it feel like a bit of a rundown building. I created some beams out of thin strips of foam core, but as thin as these are, they're really not that thin. To make them feel more like they were embedded, I rolled them out flat using a rolling pin. Now, if you don't have one of these, literally anything cylindrical that doesn't have a pattern on it that it might transfer onto the beams can work. Spray paint can, any food containers, something like that. The idea was for each wall segment to have multiple panels separated by these beams. An issue I noticed once I had cut all of the windows and everything out was that almost every place I was going to have a panel had some sort of feature already, which would make it hard to do the diagonal beams that you see in a lot of these. So I would just skip those on all but the blank panels. I created a door using the cutout piece as a template and 2 small pieces of foam core glued together. If I was doing this again, I think I would make the door itself a single piece thick, just to give more dimensions to it, to make the door feel like it was more set into the building than everything else. I wanted all the windows to have a bit of a sill, so using the cutout piece as a template, I cut out these little T-shaped wedges that would actually sit on the windowsill itself. Using some segments from the framing beams, I just cut out little pieces and continued the rest of the frame around. The door itself was framed with some slightly thicker pieces with a bit of a decorative overhang. Then it was time to start blocking out some of the panels. Since I wanted this building to not feel like it was too proud, I decided to make it a very shallow angle on the roof. I also created some interior supports that would hold up the main body of the roof. It had to happen eventually. I glued together the wall segments using tacky glue. I made the pieces as square as I could using the grid on my cutting mat and then pinned them right around the corners. Since I was going to be covering them with the framing beams, there wouldn't be any chance of seeing any of the holes. Using the edge of one of the roof pieces as a measurement guide, I created a cardboard substructure to attach all of the pieces to. I hot glued the 2 end pieces flush with the edges and then the interior supports equidistant from each other. I lined the second piece up with some healthy globs of hot glue and then laid it all together. Don't worry if the pieces don't match perfectly or there's a bit of a gap at the beginning, because we'll be covering that with the shingles. I was going to use cereal box cardboard to create oversized shingles. These were approximately 1-inch squares, but since this wasn't supposed to be a nice building, I didn't care if the measurements were not precise. Then I just cut out a bunch of these, and I mean a bunch. Making sure to leave a little bit of overhang on the sides and at the bottom, I did an alternating and slightly overlapping pattern. Err on the side of too much overhang rather than too little. You can always trim it down. I used an X-Acto knife to add some small cuts in the surface of each panel to create a wooden texture. And then for the roof cap, I just took some of the shingles and creased them a little bit. You're not looking for a sharp crease, more of a gentle curve. I hid the cardboard edges by adding framing beams to the roof. Cut the beams in an angle so that they fit together nicely. With the roof done, I added some framing beams to the corners to hide the seams, and then continued adding them on the tops of each of the panels, and then added diagonal beams to all of the panels that didn't have some other feature. I created the mantel using a square of foam core with a shelf on top to hold whatever precious goods this farmhouse had. For the back of the fireplace and the chimney, I used a block of XPS insulation foam and cut out a vague shape. I wasn't too worried about these cuts being clean as I was going to cover this in brickwork. While trying to figure out how I was going to attach this to the outside of the building, I noticed a bit of a problem. The roof wasn't sitting flat, causing a gap between the removable section and the rest of the building. I tried all sorts of things to get this to lay flat. I hacked away with a knife, I trimmed with scissors, but it just wouldn't work. Not sure what else to do, I created a frame out of long pieces of foam core. This would create something that I could glue the roof onto in such a way that hopefully, no matter how weird the roof itself was, at least this would sit flat against the top of the building. I glued this together using as little tacky glue as possible to prevent any chance of warping, and I really liked the way it ended up looking. Just to be safe, I also added a whole bunch of hot glue into the peak of the roof, just to create some extra weight to keep this as flat as possible. I had seen some pictures of this wedge-shaped fireplace that I wanted to try. All of the pictures I saw were more like lordly manners, and this absolutely wasn't that. But again, let's go rule of cool and not let historical accuracy bog us down. I used the piece that I cut out of the back wall as a guide for cutting into the XPS section. This would help keep the angle consistent between the two. The walls of the small room were going to be made of a single wide piece of foam core, and the door was going to have no actual door. It was just going to be an archway. This would help prevent any more of the floor space being taken up by interior features. Once I added a brick texture to the interior of the fireplace, all of these little features started to get attached with hot glue. The fireplace exterior, the mantle, and then the larger extension of the chimney up to the roof line. Time to make some bricks. I cut them out of strips of foam core and textured them by tossing them into a Tupperware container with some rocks and giving it a good shake. The rough rocks will really add some stone texture. They'll soften the corners and make them look much better and save you so much time versus texturing each individual one with a ball of tin foil or trying to do it after they've been attached. I actually would end up making several different sizes. Gluing the bricks on is a bit of tedious work. Just keep the pattern alternating so that you don't have any of the grout lines matching up. The chimney piece I cut actually wasn't long enough, so I took the window segments that I cut out and stacked them up on each other and drew in a brick pattern. I glued them together, not perfectly straight, as I wanted this to have something of a ramshackle appearance, and then added a cap to the chimney. Another issue. Since the building sat on top of the floor, there was actually a naked edge that was going to look weird. I tried a couple different things to fix this. I thought maybe gluing bricks along it would create something like a foundation. That seemed weak, so I thought maybe longer strips would be stronger, but I realized pretty much anything that I was going to do was just dodging the problem. I had to make a completely new base. With less than half an inch added on either side, this would allow me to create a fake foundation that would extend past the edge of the building. I marked off the stone outline, created the wood grain in the center, and the stone on the outside. To create more visual interest, I created some cracks and shattered flagstones to break up the monotony of the border. I created a large hearthstone piece that actually sat inside the fireplace as though to protect the floor from flames. The whole project got a base coat of Mod Podge mixed with black craft paint. A tip for painting larger objects: paint anything that this piece is going to rest on first. That way, by the time you get around to finishing the rest of the base coat, the first things that you'll paint will be dry and you'll leave less imprints on whatever surface it's drying off. For any surfaces that aren't taking the Mod Podge really well, like exposed hot glue or the glossy cereal box packaging, hit them with some brush-on primer. I used a dark gray as the base coat for all of the stonework, the foundation, the chimney, the hearth, everything. I picked out some different colors to pick out individual stones to add some more interest, and in this case I went with a very monochromatic palette. While these are obviously bricks and not found stone, I still wanted it to feel like these maybe came from a river nearby, all from the same source. All of the stone got a light dry brush in a plain gray to help pick out all of the stone texture that we added on, or that was added from rolling it around in the bin of rocks. I wanted this to feel like a really old building, so I went with an aged wood look. This is done with what's called an overbrush of the golden brown. An overbrush is kind of halfway between a actual base coat and a dry brush. You're really not aiming for perfect coverage here. For that real aged in the sun look, all of the wood got a medium dry brush of a fog gray. All of the panels got hit with an off-white. At this point, we're doing some precision painting, so your brush selection kind of matters here. You want something that's large enough that it's going to carry enough paint that you can do these panels in a reasonable amount of time, but also small enough that you can get into the little corners on the triangle pieces. I did the colors in this order on purpose. I knew that if there was a bit of a mistake and some of the white got onto the wood, that would just feel like whoever was waddling this daub made a bit of a mistake and got some of the clay or whatever it is onto the wood. Whereas if I did it the other way, it wouldn't make sense if the wood color was on the panels themselves. At this point, I wasn't really liking this color. It felt too much like plaster, and I wanted this to be more like mud. I ended up mixing some golden brown and the vanilla, and it got a slightly browner color. When my first batch ran out, I realized I had basically just made my suede. I just lightened it a little bit and carried on with the rest. I decided to paint the roof panels blue, but this blue was a bit too bright, so I mixed in just a touch of brown to desaturate it a little bit. Alright, I promise this is the last time I'm going to say historical accuracy in this video. This roof doesn't make sense. It would be thatched, not wood, and if it was wood, it wouldn't be painted, and if it was painted, it would not be painted this color. But like I say, I'm not going to let history stop me. This thing needed a pop of color, and the roof was a perfect place to do just that. The whole roof got a dry brush of a turquoise. This helps bring out all of those wonderful edges and all of that knife texture that we put in with the X-Acto. Everything here got a liberal dose of my homemade black wash. This really gets into all of the cracks and just helps the detail pop. I went back to some of the white areas with a baby wipe, or a paper towel could also work, and dabbed away some of the wash. This would help create a starker contrast between the light and dark areas. Once that had all dried, I went back in with a homemade brown wash and hit any areas of the lower panels where I felt like water and grunge might have accumulated. I also did kind of a blotting, stippling fade towards the center of each panel. That way the lines weren't so harsh. A couple of the panels got similar treatment, just to add some variation to the roof. To tie all the parts together, I did a light dry brush in a suede color. This would bring the highlights back, especially to the wood, and any of the areas on the panels where it was too dark could also help to blend that transition. With the interior completely finished, it was now time to glue the base to the building itself. I lined it up, making sure that I could only see wood on the inside and stone on the outside, and then rechecked it about 100 times before I felt safe in actually gluing it together. Then it was just a matter of adding the glue and jury-rigging a way to weight this thing down while it dried. I went back with a paintbrush and removed any of the glue that squished out from underneath. The hearth and the bedroom walls got installed just in time for a melon eclipse. I used some brown to stipple on mud on the threshold. Little details like this may not be the most obvious, but they can really bring pieces to life. Some final details were a sooty dry brush on the inside of the chimney and the fireplace, an effect as subtle as it is unfilmable. As usual, I used some green and brown washes to just add a little more grime to this piece. Mildew on the floor, water stains on the walls, things like that. Before a final detail, I sealed the whole thing with a coat of a matte varnish. To create a cobweb, I tore up a dried out baby wipe to get some fibers to stick in the corner. I brushed the glue on the surfaces I was going to attach it to rather than put the glue on the fibers themselves. They were so fine that there was no way that that wasn't going to end up clumping or looking silly. So there we have it, the first building in our farm series within a series. In the next video, we're going to be moving outdoors and working on a small animal pen, and at least one more video after that should wrap up the farm mini-series. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, consider giving it a thumbs up and subscribing to the channel. Comment, share it far and wide. Anything like that really helps me out. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.